That's there. You
Just for the recording, this is a work session for equity and access and workforce. So
Well,
how would
if
you
I-
like,
if
how would
I
you
may-
like to proceed?
Yeah. Commissioner, if I may, I'd like to see the recommendations, but just to push, but I do know that access is a problem for many types of families. And so that's somewhat on my mind. And I know you've been very good at looking at that in the past, but we have families that are right at that cutoff. And I'm concerned about, making sure that everyone has access to good, affordable childcare. I know it's a big, big task, and I think it's going to take us a long time to get there, but that has always been something there, because I hear from so many people that, so much of their salary is taken up in just trying to find good childcare. So that is on my mind there. I also am very strong advocate for making sure everything is equitable. So I would like to see what the professionals and your team, what you're recommending, because I'd like to keep in concert with everyone.
Sure. All right, we've been joined by a few other panel members, Karen Lott, Carmelita Valencia Day, Althea Brooks, and Maria Vargas. So does that work for you all? If we just in 5 minutes, just sort of run through the recommendations, and then this is really meant to be a work session for panel members. So we have tried to bring together everyone who's been working in this work group, all the leaders, so they can answer your questions and you can tell us what you think or where we should be moving. So why don't we, I know, is it Leah, maybe you have the workforce recommendations. Do you want to start with just as high level as we can, because I don't want to use time. If you could have those, and then Deb, you could walk us through those recommendations if Leah can bring up that. And then Jen, if you can be ready with equity and access after that. Does that make sense? It's very organic, these meetings, they're work meetings. Okay. Leah, if you can bring those up.
I can. I just need Eloisa to give me access.
Oh, Eloisa, can you give Leah access?
She has access now.
Thank you. Perfect.
Thanks, everybody, for being here. Okay.
And I can just be guided, Deb and Deb. Let me just make this a little bit bigger. I'm assuming we just want to kind of jump in here and then can flip to the other recommendations, but maybe I'll pause in case Deb or Deb want to say anything framing wise before we get into the other slides.
No, I think let's just go. Okay. Deb Adams, I'll do the first one. I'll kick you the second one.
Sure.
Deal? Okay, great. Okay, so there are 3 buckets of recommendations from the workforce work group. They are compensation, professional pathways and technical assistance, and recruitment and retention. So what you're seeing on the slide are the 4 bullets of the draft recommendations around compensation. They include the need to update the existing compensation schedule report, which needs to be adjusted based on some inputs that we used to do the calculations and aligned with the unifying framework. The second recommendation is the unifying framework recommendation to adopt the 3 educator level roles that are identified in the national unifying framework. The set of recommendations that came out of a national level discussion of 15 early childhood organizations. The third recommendation is to consider strategies for improved benefits associated with a compensation package, and to also explore some non-traditional benefits options to see if those can become inputs to a stronger compensation package. And then finally, to share broadly the importance of the structure of the profession and its value to families and to children's development. And I think for those of you who participated in discussion on the compensation recommendations in the Blue Ribbon Panels meeting, you may remember that this item actually got a fair amount of discussion about the need to elevate the importance of the profession and frankly, the inadequacy of the structure as it exists now for both delivering high quality care for children and families and for supporting the workforce writ large by enabling parents to remain in the workforce. So I'll move that over to Deb to do the next one.
Great. Thanks, Deb. And good evening, everyone. So the second of the three items is the professional pathways and technical assistance. And the first bullet outlines the possibility of restructuring Connecticut's early childhood credentialing and certification systems into an ECE professional licensure system that would align with the unifying framework. So this is both about OEC and the State Department of Education certification system for early childhood endorsements. The second item is to utilize the NAEYC professional standards and competencies as the basis for designing OEC developed and or sponsored professional development pathways. And a note on that is that our higher education programs that have early childhood plan programs of study have already adopted the NAEYC professional standards and competencies and are using them currently to take a look at their coursework and their key assessments. And so this would be about bringing some of our professional development that is about in-service in line with those competencies and professional standards. And the third bullet is about funding the professional pathways and technical assistance system itself. So including higher education and in-service training, we need a lot more people to do the great work of training people, both in higher education as faculty and adjunct faculty, as well as professional development in service for training and technical assistance, coaching, and mentoring. So that sort of rounds out a bit about professional pathways and technical assistance. And of course, there's lots and lots probably to unpack around that and how it would be done. And so the third item, do you want to take the third one as well, Deb?
Oh, sure.
That was you were leading that group, that subgroup.
We're back in our old cadence.
You
Okay.
are.
Third bucket, recruitment and retention. Draft recommendations are separated into those two categories. The first recommendation is to expand the introduction of the joy and importance of the work of early care and education as a profession and as a desirable profession for high school and maybe even younger learners, so that they begin to build interest and understand what the profession is all about, and to make apprenticeship available for those folks as a pathway into the field and to feed an opportunity for advanced formal educational credentials should they choose to do that. Next is to leverage directors as leaders. These are the folks who serve as the face of our field. They are recruiters. They are out there in the front explaining and showing what this profession is all about. And they are a key in the recruitment and retention of staff in their programs. Thirdly, around retention is to implement marketing strategies that attract individuals to the field, folks who might have considered this work or been in this work previously and who could come back to it. Folks who are interested and already doing similar work that could come into the field once the profession is compensated appropriately. This is as good a job as it gets out there, and we need to bring folks into it. Then the retention pieces include retention-focused benefits in the compensation package, follow and adopt a pay scale that has mobility and steps for experience. In other words, recognize both the formal credentials and opportunities that ongoing professional PD can create in terms of advancing someone's role and or changing someone's role in the profession. And then creating career pathways which utilize partnerships with the colleges so that we're giving credit toward achieving credentials or degrees while working. We know that this is important, especially because our existing working population needs help and support to find ways to achieve those credentials while they are trying to support themselves and their families. So I think that concludes the recommendations from the three buckets on workforce. And we're happy to answer questions now or move on to the overview of the equity and access pieces, whatever you'd like to do, Commissioner.
Why don't we hold for just a minute? I see we've been joined by Audette, another panel member, so welcome Audette, and everybody else on the call matters too, but this is a time for panel members. So panel members, do you want to stop and talk about workforce for 20 minutes, 30 minutes, and then move on to equity and access? Or would you like to hear those recommendations too? What's going to work best for you?
For me, it works best if we could, you put too much in. And I can't-
Let's stop here.
Yeah,
Okay, so
it sounds better, but and thank you so much for this refresher. Now it's all coming back to me, what we had spoken about, and I think all these areas are so vital, and we've hit on all of them. I think we have made some progress in each of these areas recently, but this is good that we're identifying what all the next steps are, so we can really be sure that once we come up with these recommendations, that they're going to be viable and that we can actually implement what we're saying. But I think which bucket it's under, but I think everything will come, at least for me, it looks like things will come into place once we really commit to that compensation schedule and to those different tiers there and what we're doing. And then I think you'll see more natural. Once that's done, I think that'll start the process of getting more people interested in early childcare when they realize we're not asking for you to come in and do this tremendous work, but we're not going to compensate you. So thank the people that put that together, who's made all these recommendations. I just think they're perfect. And what we can do more with the pathways, I think we need to continue to work in that area with part of the compensation package, be creative. I'm not sure what else we can do, but I'd like to see us keep thinking about even more ways to have in the compensation package to recruit. I just wondered, I know this could be totally off topic, but has there ever been any interaction? I know we've talked about making Connecticut the place to visit, right? And with DECD, I'm wondering if, rather than reinvent, if there's anything we can look at in some of their marketing, what they have done to help us. That was just
that's interesting. Yeah. We, I'm glad you're asking this question, Representative McCarty, and just very quickly so other panel members can chime in too and ask us questions or say, I think you should focus on this recommendation first or whatever. We have, I think, what's a really nice workforce recruitment video and campaign, social media campaign. We're finding it very hard to know what's working and not working. So we're really digging in, and I think you make a good suggestion, Maggie, maybe we can talk to the folks at the folks promoting Connecticut to ask how they know if their systems are working, because we say we want a marketing campaign, but we want one that works. So, or I don't know if there are any panel members that have experience or others about just figuring out what the impact is. It looks like Karen, you have your hand up.
Good afternoon. Just one quick question. In the slide about the compensation, it made reference to like non-traditional benefits. I was just wondering what that referenced. I do think the benefits are super important, and I'm learning more about that there are different ways to offer benefits beyond what we normally think about. So I was just wondering what came up as a part of that conversation.
Yeah, really, really good question. I think some of those were things like, and Deb, you can add in, but like presumptive eligibility for childcare workers, so that they get some preference to have childcare so they can work. And then we've been talking more and more about healthcare access and helping programs afford healthcare, because there are many childcare providers do not have healthcare, and even if their employers offer it, sometimes they turn it down because of the copay. So but I don't know, what do you mean by non-traditional, Deb Bliss?
There was also, I want to point out in the May public listening session, the May event that we had in Norwalk. Remember that there was a panel where there was some conversation about housing
Oh, housing, right?
and opportunities for housing associated with workforce or with organizations that were delivering childcare. That's probably the most outside the box, non-traditional idea that's been proposed. Deb Adams, I don't know if you recall any others.
Yeah, I'm reviewing the issue brief.
Yeah,
And a few of the things that were listed there are thinking about paid planning time, thinking about the day in the life of teaching staff and paid time to do the thinking work.
Mhm.
it's disappointing that we have to consider those benefits.
I know.
Say that.
Me
Ouch.
too.
Those of us who were teachers just went ouch.
Yeah.
Yeah, if I may just say, if we could find something very unique to this compensation back, I think that would do something other than what we've done in the past. I
Yeah.
think that does help. And there are in some of the other committees, there is work going on to offer housing and different benefits.
Yeah.
So if we could come up with something, I think that would be advantageous.
Okay, there's some options, yeah. Althea, you have your hand up.
Thank you, Commissioner. Hopefully this is not too far in the weeds, and good evening, everyone, and please excuse my voice. On the number 2, and thank you so much for the work on this. This is really great and hugely helpful. And I'm trying to recall if I shared this insight on this group or with the equity and access, so forgive me if it's more fitting.
There's so much overlap. They're all going to overlap. I think that's what you're going to realize today.
Okay, so with the number 2, professional pathways and TA, so some of what I shared just based on what I've heard from providers is the concern around trainings and the ability to participate in them in professional development. We know the challenges, many of us have, the luxury, right, of being able to go to conferences and things like that without it really being disruptive to our day-to-day work, whereas our providers don't necessarily have that same luxury. And so my concern has been, as we to Representative McCarty's point about really put this in action and opportunities for seeking trainings, how do we do it in a way where it doesn't impact the delivery of service on both sides, right? Closing, possibly losing fees, but also for parents who have to find alternative forms of care. So one of the things that may be a twofer around recruitment and retention is possibly thinking about a permanent sub pool, like, right, training individuals to serve in like a sub pool. School districts do it. Students become familiar with the faces, and it becomes a way to potentially maybe feed that apprenticeship or become a pipeline for teachers by getting that experience. Maybe it can count towards, the CDA or something to that effect. But I think it's something we need to think about, because the opportunities to be able to access trainings and support and professional development is a part of really lifting the profession the way that it deserves, without providers being concerned about potentially closing to do that. So I just want to lift that. If it was too far in the weeds, I apologize, but it is something that I've heard very often and we need to think about.
Not at all. And in fact, I don't think it was mentioned in the brief, and it might have been in some of the back conversations, but I do think it's important to lift that up, making PD accessible to staff. So with substitutes and things like paid time off for PD, that kind of thing. So I think that's super important. And we've got to recognize, like, especially when we think of family childcare providers, they don't have an infrastructure. So having a sub pool for them, and centers need them too. I'm sure Karen will chime in and say a sub pool would be amazing. Save you some hours in the classroom. So thank you for that, Althea. We'll definitely add that in. Kit, you have any, or Carmelita? I should call you Carmelita probably, right?
That's fine, Commissioner. So thank you. So I just want to piggyback on some of the comments that Representative McCarthy made, and I think Karen Lott. So first of all, I know that the thrust of this is compensation. We really cannot, the way I see it, these are all good recommendations, but unless we really work on the compensation schedule, all these recommendations, the way I'm looking at it, may be, I'm sorry, a mute point. I don't know if that's the right word.
Yeah.
Because, for example, if we're saying we're adopting 3 educator level roles, okay? There are a lot of people out there in the early childhood who does not even know the unifying framework. You throw them these terms of ECE 1, 2, and 3, the first thing they're going to say is that, but I'm only earning $10 an hour, or that's even high, okay? So compensation is really the crust of this. And my question is, I guess I'm thinking more specific, have the work group talked about, or maybe it's one of the readings that I missed reading, have we talked about what are we thinking in terms of compensation?
Yes.
Are we going up? Because I also, the recommendation of working with high schools. I work with the high school, well, Gateway does. We have a partnership with the high school, and I can tell you, every time we have a career fair, I will be beside the nursing group, and nursing group will tell them, oh, with an associate's degree, the CNAs are making even more money than our teacher aides who's going to go for an assistant teacher. So where do the students go? They go right there by the allied health nursing programs. So again, that's going back to compensation. How far can we go? Can we compete? Are we able to offer them the level of a nursing in compensation? In terms of the benefits, housing is really, to me, housing is a good benefit, but also a benefit of more money in terms of education. Think Commissioner, when we were at that celebration in New Haven, a few people were saying, there's the commissioner, talk to her, because people were whispering to me, asking, how about for graduate studies? So that they can also improve themselves. I'm just looking at the slides to make sure I covered the points. Then Deb Adams, I always ask about early childhood credentialing and certification, okay? Working on restructuring it, yes, it's good, but we have to have OEC, higher ed, and the 2-year folks talking about it. SDE, yes, but oftentimes SDE forgets about the associate degree people. Okay, we're missing. There's a hole in that conversation. Yeah, and I just heard at the meeting, at the Alliance meeting today, which surprised me, was about the certification of first grade teachers being able to teach kindergarten, and the special ed endorsement, they can teach preschool. That was the first time I heard it. And I knew that was something's happening with certification. But again, that's a conversation that we missed out.
Can we, and you can come back. This is a whole conversation, and we just have 5 or 6 panels to work. But no, we want to talk. I want to talk back and get your feedback. So it seems like compensation's coming up, and we have so much power over it, but not much power over other parts of it. 70% of the system is private. What are some ways that the agency can drive compensation changes? So we talked about potentially using the leverage of the state-funded system to try to, push up wages everywhere. If OEC, and this would all have to be staged in, But to get compensation up, you need to get the rates up to the level that it'll support the compensation. And the only place that OEC has any control over the rates is in the state-funded system. So maybe there are other ideas about getting the rates up. Now, we have increased Care for Kids like 11% a year for 3 years. That gets us to about 50 to 70% of the market rate, depending on where you are. So these aren't small ticket items, simply to get even the state-funded system there. The compensation is just that, would be a huge recommendation with large costs from the panel. But as you think about the system, and some of you work in public and some of you work in nonprofit, and a lot of you interface with different parts of the system, you know, what power does the panel have to bring up compensation across the state? I just named a couple, but maybe you have other ideas, given the public-private nature and the state not generally dictating wages for small businesses. I think that's the complexity that we wanted to talk about a little today with y'all, get your feedback or ideas. Audette, you have your hand up. I don't know if it was for something else or if you want to comment on this.
Well, I just had 2 questions really, and I just wanted to say thank you for today so that we can have an opportunity to ask some of these questions. But what I'm hearing and what I'm reading is the problems that are laid out here are exactly what I'm struggling with, like every day. And you know, and as we go along, we have to operate. And so I'm coming up with plans for, you know, how am I going to have a workforce that's starting out and trained in the basics, just the very, very basics. And so my question is, I'm wondering, at this like ECE 1 level, is there a consideration for like the very basic entry level, you know, staff people that are coming to us? I had over 100 applicants this year for jobs, and I can tell you not even a handful had experience or education. That was really dismal. And so we quickly have put together something that we hope will give a baseline. But, you know, what is the consideration for entry level and the ECE 1 level?
Yeah. Deb Fliss, or Deb Adams, I don't know if you can speak specifically to the ECE 1. And by the way, that's exactly what we're trying to do, is to provide steps.
Yeah.
And also, it's not that we're pulling away from the bachelor's, but it's that we're saying having an associate's and an ECE 2 does prepare you at a higher level to teach in a classroom. And we're sort of adding respect to that associate's level, you know, so there is a stairway up. But on the ECE 1, I'm not necessarily the best person to describe that.
Well, I don't know that I have the answer specifically to the question, but Audette's making me think about some of the conversations that we had about joint training and ways to offer training for entry-level folks that would help you efficiently and appropriately orient new staff. So some of those 100 folks who applied to you would have access to some of the most basic but really important pieces of training and information early on in their employ with you, so that you don't have to keep repeating that and sharing it over and over again. That we could deliver and create a structure for that could take some of that burden off of you and help you get people classroom ready more quickly.
So that the OEC would be participating in this recruitment and baseline training?
Well, not necessarily that we participate in your recruitment. We haven't really we haven't talked about that, is what I should say, is my answer to, but that we could deliver some of that baseline training, something like a shared services type model where folks could participate in training that we're delivering that would help sort of level that playing field. What do you need to know about licensing? On day one, when you walk in a classroom, what do you need to know about licensing? What do you need to know about basic health and safety? Can we do more expansive first aid, CPR, and med admin so that you have folks who can actually fill those roles when you need them in your classroom?
Yeah, that's kind of a question, is how do we get, people interested? Because I don't know if it's a local thing, but if there was a way for folks to get a baseline and maybe even come to us with first aid and CPR already as kind of a pre-employment training. But I mean, we're talking about the basics of teaching people, like you need to count the kids. I mean, I hate to say it, but these are critical. Yeah. So I was thinking maybe the high school kids are through adult ed, but there's really a larger amount of people coming in that have very basic or little training before they come to us. At least they're looking, the pool is expanding. The pool is
That's a
expanding.
big, yeah, that sounds like an improvement, but to your point.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah. And so I think that was my question about the entry level. And then just with regards to benefits, certainly as a small nonprofit, we struggle with that all the time, and it should be much better. So anything that can come along, like you said, shared services, or something that might be state sponsored, or I don't know, but the benefit packages, I think, really need to be looked at for these young kids, the kids that are coming in, and is it a viable career for 20 years from now? Like, I'm turning almost 63, right? And I'm looking back and saying, what have I got for my own retirement, and what do my benefits look like? And then one last question, with regards to the competencies, have you taken a look for like the school age population and how those competencies from the National After School Association might fit in?
It's a really good point. We talk about NAFCC and NAEYC, but I think it's important that we bring in the NAFCC as well in that quality section. So I don't know, Deb, what the conversations have been there.
Just to say that as our system is based on the idea that we will ground ourselves in national standards, the school age standards are the next place we need to go. I think what's a little squishy for us is it's not clear which set of standards are the standards to which we could or should best anchor. So that might be a good conversation that we could have.
Right. And it's a smaller population, I know, but they do align closely with the NAEYC competencies. So it might not be such a hard crosswalk.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Can I bring us back to the compensation with panel members at all? Your thoughts about approaching compensation, because we got to think as a system, and then we can continue this, but we got to also we want to get to equity and access. My wife told me not to say gotta, and so I apologize. She's told me it doesn't sound good when I say gotta, and I do it all the time. We need to move on to.
Well, Commissioner, I think we've made it a point in the legislature this past session and the few before. Everyone, I think, is aware that we need to do something about compensation.
Yeah.
So I'm glad that you said, because I get a little confused sometimes and forget that we have different types of and can we be dictating compensation outside of the state fund? I think that's part of what we need to contemplate and figure that out. But and please forgive me for this question, but our risk centers that we have throughout the state, when we were just now talking about training and all, do we maximize, do we utilize, could we utilize?
Representative, you might have noted that we had a bill this year that would have made it easier for OEC to contract with the risks like SDE can, because SDE can really leverage them we can't in the same way. We do leverage them as much as we can. But that could be a recommendation of the panel to allow OEC to work with the RESCs in the same way that the State Department of Ed does as a regional partner to try to get this training out. So that would be a statutory, that would require statutory change. It never made it to the floor. but
We're
it
gonna
did
work
make
on
it-
that.
It made it through the committee.
Yeah, well, let's work on that because I
Yeah.
think it could be a
It's a
very
really great.
partner. And I know Learn Down Here is doing some really fabulous work moving with the magnet school over and looking to even absorb special education and a lot of the other issues. So that
Yeah.
I'm glad you clarified that for me. And I'll be happy to do all I possibly can, but I think we've made progress with the legislature understanding, and businesses should get on board. The more we explain the problem, maybe there is a solution that we could have willingly everyone participating to say, we've got to do something here. It does impact so much the workforce. And so I'm optimistic. I just don't know how to do it, but I'm willing
Yeah.
to,
All right,
I'm willing
well,
say
Yeah.
I'm there for you. I know CEA is doing quite a bit with looking at minimum starting and getting the state to step in to help, but those are pretty much on the public schools. But again, I think if we put our minds together, we'll find a way to get this accomplished, because it has to happen.
yeah. Yeah, and we're open to your ideas. Kit, do you have your hand up again?
I
Or is-
apologize.
Sorry. Yes, thank you. It's not about compensation, but I just wanted to also add that in terms of training, like what Odette was talking about, basic training, it's good. Don't forget lab schools. Don't forget the lab schools in your community, the community colleges. We have a lot, the lab schools have a lot to offer. And that's also one thing that maybe it's in the recommendations, Deb and Deb, but I did not see, leveraging with the lab schools in higher ed. You have leveraging in public schools, but if we
Yeah.
can include leveraging with the lab schools, that will be also another way of providing training.
Yeah, you could imagine the lab schools or the RESTs developing a curriculum
Yes.
for the first time, just starting kiddos.
Yeah, and also providing a site to be, for apprenticeships. I'm
Yeah.
using the word that they have.
Yeah, good reminder.
Commissioner, would it be at all possible, I mean, even if we don't know what the entry level would be, or, the next step, the associate, just have a sense of what dollars we would be talking? I know at one point I saw we needed, $700 million to put our
Yeah.
early
It's
childcare
not
on the
that,
right
yeah.
path.
It's not
So-
that much, but
Yeah.
yes, I know that our next, we have financing. And I know Jen's been working hard on this
Okay.
question with the finance group about some of those costs. Some are very high. I think I think, the reason we haven't picked off compensation over the past since the mid-90s when we started this is because it's super expensive. But I think we've made some solid progress over the past few years at the legislature in adding. I think we figured out we've added 63% since 2022. So there are more funds now, but what you hear out there, well, it was in the newspaper today across the state, there's still a crisis, and programs are still struggling to recruit staff and pay staff appropriately. So that's our puzzle, is how do we address this, the sort of core problem that you've all been talking about today is probably the most expensive problem. So that, that's going to be, I think that's the challenge here.
Well, we put in the proposal, as you know very well, did not impact early childcare, but a flood of new education dollars, K through 12.
Yeah.
We need a kind of a similar approach with a proposal that really recognizes the need that people understand that you can't go to the next step unless we have early childcare. To me, that is
Right.
got to be the number one priority going
Yeah.
for that we get.
I love that, Representative.
Yeah.
That's why you're on the panel.
Well, I'll do whatever I can. I don't have
Yeah.
the solution, but I think something
Yeah.
like that where we recognize it still doesn't answer your, and I'm glad you keep bringing that up because, and maybe we could have your insight more on how many of the private providers are we looking at that we have to get everybody on board for this somehow.
Yeah, that is a challenge, is just that they're private businesses. So, and I do think we have to keep thinking as a panel, because I know probably you're feeling a little overwhelmed, but we're trying to lay out a 5-year plan, that this all has to happen in stages. Like we talk about the unifying framework, I think as we close this part of the conversation, even though we'll come back to it because they're all overlapping, I think that's a real game changer for our state, and it really gives us a North Star and helps our higher ed institutions line up, help our high schools line up, help our providers know what they need to do, help. And it's going to be a challenge also bringing the public schools in, that to teach early childhood, whether you're in a private or a public setting, it's a set of skills. And these are the skills that are going to be expected, and the compensation aligns with those skills. But getting that in place is going to take a few years, to get it all lined up. The compensation is not going to go up in 1 year. That's going to take a number of years and a commitment over time. So I think we can just try to think of it that way, and we really need the panel to help us stage it. All right, Karen, what do you got for us? Oh, there, I did it.
Just one really quick question.
Yeah.
In terms of the compensation, is there data on the range of compensation for teachers between state-funded programs and other early childhood education programs across the state? I'm just wondering if there's a sense of what the ranges are.
It's a good question. I think Deb, that would be a really good question to bring to our registry. Because of the wage supports, we now have way more private programs in the registry. But in order to get the funds out, we didn't make them fill out all the information, but we're asking for it over time. So we have some information. So I think we'll take that as a panel question that we will answer and bring back to you.
Okay.
I don't know the answer. And I don't have a sense of it. I did a salary survey of the state back when I worked at Trinity, and there wasn't that much difference, but it's a lot of years have passed since 1998 or something.
Just a few.
So, all right, Deb, does that make sense to ask Margaret if she can look at that at all?
Yeah, so we've actually been talking about doing some outreach to those organizations that participated in wage supports to try to get some more info. We need to plan a little, a series of strategies to bring them in. Karen, I want to ask for a little clarifier on your question, if I may. So is your question about looking at ECE related organizations only, so the state funded in comparison to the private, and or was your question about ECE in the community based programs and ECE in the public school settings or birth to 3 or other places? I wasn't sure which way you were leaning in your question.
Yeah. Sorry about not being clear. So I was referencing more the state-funded programs, the community-based programs, not so much the public schools, because I think we all know that there's a pretty big gap between ECE and community and community-based programs, state-funded programs. I was just kind of wondering too about some of the private programs, right? That have a little bit more latitude than the state-funded programs do, right? And so are they investing those funds into staff wages? right? So what does that look like? I mean, when we talk about, you know, you can't impose it across the whole state. But I don't know, it just kind of reasons to me that there's some places where the wages should not be as low as maybe they are.
Yeah.
In like for me as a state funded program. So I'm just curious about that
Okay.
data stream.
Thanks,
Does that
Karen.
make sense, Deb?
Thank you.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And I think you're getting at something really important, which is if we're thinking all we can do is impact the system we have, how much will that impact the rest of the system? My thinking is, but I don't have a like view into the future, is that between the public schools and then if you have state funded programs, all with the rates coming up, that it does put some pressure on the system, or at least, you know, the highly qualified staff, that competition will ratchet up. But who knows? Who knows? All right, I'm going to ask Elena and Lorna to walk us through the equity and access. And panel members, again, this is your time. So once we're done, if you want to come back, something hit you about the workforce, you can do that. And we're going to make more office hours so we can have more sort of question and work time like this. But Elena, why don't you take it away, or Lorna, whichever you decided you're starting.
Sure. I'm going to kick it off, and I know we're excited to jump into this and have a great conversation like you just did on workforce and compensation and quality. So, so we have 5 buckets of work. It's around unmet needs, affordability, parent engagement and navigation, community voice, and child and family outcomes. So a little bit of context here. We were the first ones out of the gate. And so this is, some of our thinking has definitely evolved and grown. And some of this work actually will probably be able to resonate with around systems, because some of this work has actually moved into our buckets of systems work as well. So we'll go through some of that as we go through. Next slide. So around unmet need here, and this is a great example, around systems, we're really thinking about improving the demand and supply of the tracking systems, right? How to make sure that we have up-to-date, accurate information about the true needs of families in a timely manner, and then being able to track and understand how are those needs being met. Then around being able to increase funding around startup for facility expansion and businesses that want to get going and expand and grow. And linking that to really incentivizing the development of additional infant and toddler slots. So we know already that our demand is a lot around infant and toddler slots, but we also know that there is need around the supply of being able to meet the needs of all children. So really looking at multilingual, culturally responsive, children with special needs, and some of those non-traditional hours, such as extended hours, overnight, and weekend care. And some of this is also looking at changing ratio and group sizes. Next slide. You know, our state funded programs are a significant funding stream for us. And so we have several recommendations around how do we, you know, expand access to and better utilize the state funded programs. In addition, looking at assessing the feasibility of Connecticut's paid parental leave program. So next I'll hand it over to Lorna to review affordability.
Thank you very much. And I have to say, it's rather timely that we're going after the previous presenters, because with lots of reference made to systems, and as you made reference to, Elena, a lot of the work that we're doing has fallen within that bucket. What clearly is highlighted throughout all of what we're articulating is that equity and access is really in all of the groups that are working in support of Blue Ribbon Panel. And we have some suggestions here to demonstrate that. So with respect to affordability, essentially, we're saying that we want to expand the reach of subsidies. When we think high level in terms of goals, a goal is to ensure subsidies reaching potential eligible families, including families currently just out of reach of subsidies. And we have some examples here. For example, expanding childcare subsidy funding, increasing affordability of the childcare for middle income families just out of reach of subsidies and unable to access state and funded programs. And within this body as well of affordability, another goal is to limit family payments to a recommended amount based on their income level and building on OEC's equitable parent copay schedule. So again, we know that in order to achieve many of the goals we're talking about, we have to ensure that it's affordable for all families, all children, all needs that are present. Next slide, please. So when we talk about affordability, we must again remember who we're talking about. And as Elena made reference to the 5 buckets that we are speaking of with respect to unmet needs, affordability, parents, community voice, child and family outcomes, what is central throughout all of that is we're talking about children. So no matter what numbers we're talking about, no matter what goals we're talking about, in essence, we're talking about children. And with respect to that, we certainly know that we need to have parents and caregivers at the table from the get-go in talking about the children and families that we strive to serve. So one primary goal is to ensure parents are central to the ECE system. Again, they're part of the discussion at the forefront, not an afterthought, not an accessory, but at the forefront. And in doing so, we want to recognize and empower and embed families as key decision makers in the ECE system at the local and the state level. Again, key figures with all elements of conversation. And with that too, another goal that we have with respect to parent engagement and navigation is to design and develop parent portal and navigation systems that combine technological platforms as well as on-the-ground trusted advisors to give parent voice and agency. We all certainly have talked about, we know the best form of advertisement is word of mouth. And so no matter how much we put in writing, no matter how much we put out there, many times it comes down to folks talking to one another. And we want to make sure that what is talked about accurately reflects what we're striving to do in a way that's collaborative and where our walking is matching what we're talking about. With that, passing it back to you, Elena.
Great, thank you. Next slide. So very much connected to family engagement and leadership is around community voice. So very much a strategy of equity and access is to really look to building up and making sure that community voice and multiple stakeholders and partners, including families, are at the table and are at different levels of the system to be able to continuously share their needs, their voices, their concerns, their ideas, their solutions, and to be able to convene together around ECE and related areas. And so really looking at how do we do this, covering all regional geographic areas as well as local. And part of this is around the thinking of using a common and implementing a common community needs assessment that can really accurately assess what is going on in the community, what are the needs, and being able to document that locally and also statewide, and building upon and expanding our geographic coverage of local resources and groups such as school readiness councils and local early childhood collaboratives. Next slide. And our last set of recommendations is around child and family outcomes. And so, this has been an area of a lot of discussion, but implementing a statewide system to assess Connecticut's children with learning and development from birth to age 5. So really thinking about how do we leverage existing platforms, and those can be national platforms as well, to really understand how are the children doing. And this is really, I think we need to get to a point where we're understanding what exactly is the data that we're looking to collect in this area, and being able to also think about family outcomes as well. So how are the families faring, their well-being, and how is that tracked equitably in their ability to access affordable care? So that was really fast and a big set of draft recommendations that, you know, I think that you'll hear in some of the themes and connections, as all of these pieces are very interrelated as we continue to kind of dive deeper into these recommendations.
Okay, so questions or thoughts on these recommendations?
Commissioner, I can just tell you that all of the recommendations I just heard when I should have listened instead of speaking early on, because I want to recognize the team. They hit on everything, every single area. They've done a fabulous job. Even that first one I asked about, those families that are just right at the cutoff level.
know.
Let's see what we can do there. And that was great to hear that that's part of the recommendation. And then I know you have promoted this for a long time, but to me, parental engagement and community engagement is going to be key for success. And I'm glad to see a lot of recommendations in that area. So I really am just very impressed, and I'm so glad that you have these like time that we could just talk to each other. So that we can get to that next step. But no, I'm
Representative McCarty, one area that comes up that you've been interested in, I don't know how much we talked about it here, but in the comments that have come in and in our parent survey, is access to childcare for families that have children with disabilities.
oh, yes.
That's, you know, up until the children are 3, birth to 3 will come out and support the providers. And sometimes that's enough and sometimes it's not. But then the children turn 3, and now with the change in kindergarten ages is going to be worse, because now the children turn 3 and a lot of the districts just have half-day preschool options. And so parents have to quit their jobs because they can't figure out how to get their kid to speech and PT 6 hours a week at the public schools and work. And so it's a real burden for parents with children with special needs. And now, you know, now if they have a 4.5-year-old, now they hit kindergarten, they have transportation and school day, school year programming, but now a third of the kids will wait another year. So those families who are already just hanging on like by their fingernails to figure out how to get their kids to a good schedule are not. And I don't mean to speak because I know they're panel members speaking, but I couldn't help but raise that issue. And the other issue is off-hour care, that families working weekends, evenings, even getting to work by 7 a.m., they're really struggling with childcare.
Well, and I appreciate very much you raising that again, because that is something that we have to straighten that out. You're right. And some of the changes have maybe exacerbated that a little bit. So I think we do need to focus in there. And I'm sure if it comes out as a recommendation, we're going to have more time going forward, right? We're going to make
figure it out. Yeah.
that, but then we can continue to work on that. But I am very happy that you raised that, because I agree with you. That's an important piece we have to not overlook.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Althea.
Yes, thank you, Commissioner. Great work on these recommendations, and I echo Representative McCarty's point about parent and community engagement. So I do have a question with regard to the point around community voice and the expansion of, you know, local resources, specifically speaking to school readiness councils. How are we going to ensure or hold these entities accountable for ensuring that the parent or community voice is on these councils? I know there's been some language around a 25% representation on these councils, but how are we going, especially if it's expanded, to ensure there's representation of the parent or community voice on these councils? Yeah, I think let me stop there before I go to the next thing.
I think you're hitting on a challenge that we face now. You know, I don't know, Elena or Lorna, if you want to add in, but I do think that is a problem we have.
Elaine. after
No,
you
please
started.
go.
I agree. I echo, and I thank you for raising the question at the end. I think too, what we are finding that we are going to experience is, although we have recommendations, not only for this committee, but for other committees, And as brass tacks as we can get with recommendations, it also, we're striving to not only change a system, we're also striving to change a mindset, a cultural mindset. And that is something that's not as tangible to be able to kind of measure and grasp how far along we are. And so what I mean by that is, with your point about how some may receive or respond to the importance of parent engagement and participation on committees. For some, it may be a matter of just checking the box, yes, okay, they're on this committee, but it's more than that. It's about why it's important for them to be on the committee. And that is the mindset that we are striving to encourage a wider growth on throughout. Because when there's change of mindset, then you're more likely to sustain the efforts that are put into place. And so it's kind of a both and, a concurrent process. Yes, we're not there yet, but yet is the operative word. That's what we're striving for.
Yeah, and I would just build on that and just add, we would love some good thinking, right, from all of you around, and ideas around what are the types of trainings or supports, right, that community-based providers might welcome and need to be able to have a table that is set for all voices, right, and being accepting of all voices. And so it's kind of just like when I was saying, a dual approach, right, the capacity building both on families and on organization side.
So thank you for that. And that's where my next, part B of my question was, and in so doing, how do we properly and adequately and equitably onboard them to these councils that many times are using language and acronyms that can really be intimidating to parents and community members who may not be familiar with this. So I think in addition to doing that, we have to find a way to make sure they're, to your point, Elena, equipped and ready and prepared to participate fully in those spaces so that their voices can be heard. And I did see your point, Commissioner, in the chat.
Yeah, Althea, I'm afraid this is part of what leads to doing the same thing over and over again, and the inequities in the system just remain because the other voices aren't there. And just so you know, in the systems information you got, you'll see one of the recommendations there was to go to a regional, where we'd have regional RFPs almost, and then those regional entities would have technical assistance to support local councils. That right now it's not built in our infrastructure, but it is going to be a recommendation of the systems, because the problems you're talking about are true in many. There are some highly functioning councils, but that's not the norm. It's, it's been since the late 90s, and, in many ways it's become pro forma and has not led to the kind of community responsiveness that it could have. So we do think this is a challenge that needs to be addressed, and it's in the equity because it leads to some of the inequities, and it's in the systems because we need systems. We need that infrastructure. If we're going to rely on local community decision-making, the communities need the infrastructure. So we recognize that as a problem. Karen has her hand up.
Thank you. I just wanted to make a comment about the child outcomes that it is, I think is refreshing, and I think it's needed that it points out the finding a structure, right, for that smooth transition from pre-K to the K-12 school system. Because I think there's a great disconnect, right? So as a school readiness program, we are expected to build these collaborations and partnerships. And I say this coming from the public school side. I can't remember as a principal when I reached out to a community-based program that one of my kindergartners came from, right? Unless it was a real problem, right? It's like, what was this kid like in preschool? So I think it's great that it calls that out, that there's a need for some intentional structures to be built, because I think it's expected to happen, but it just doesn't happen, right? And that's a disservice for kids. And I think the other part that's really important is pulling in the kindergarten interest inventory, because that can really give us a good set of data of how children who've been in preschool programs, what their school readiness really looked like, right, against those kindergarten markers. which I think is really, really important in legitimizing what we do and helping people understand the importance and the impact of what we do. So I'm very thrilled as a prior public school person to see that there are more connections being called out in the child outcomes that bring the early childhood community in collaboration in a structured way, right? Not just go figure out how to do it, but that it sounds like there would be an actual structure, right? That would help bring those two entities together to really look at what the outcomes are for children.
Exactly. Great. Yep, that's the goal. Althea.
Commissioner, if I may, Karen just triggered another thought. So to that, as our providers and practitioners are preparing our pre-K children for kindergarten, I know what I've found in the work we're doing, especially we're working in 5 neighborhood schools, that even so, they're pre-K 8, but they're 2 systems. It's bifurcated, right? You have, the pre-K on this side, and then the K8 here. And I find it very interesting that there's one principal in the school, but in many ways, the pre-K teachers function almost separate and apart from the K8. And so to Karen's point about really sharing what the impact is and making that smooth transition, I'm wondering how do we have our local Office of Early Childhood really work in a more integrated way with the K-12, K-8, or K-5 schools that some of these pre-K-3, pre-K-4 classrooms are in, because I find that they're, interestingly, that level of communication, or to Karen's point, if we have pre-K-3 and 4 classrooms delivering a set of curricula, right, why it should somehow work, right, in tandem with what we know kindergarten teachers are looking for when their children show up, right? So how do we work with the K-12 system to do more of that with our Office of Early Childhood and the support they provide to our pre-K-3 and 4s?
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I think in many ways that, it's incumbent upon OEC and SDE to work more closely together. You sort of see, different structures sort of passed down. So I do think that recommendation is super important around the connection. And that's where things like aligning the teaching requirements, this is what a preschool teacher does, whether it's supervised by early childhood or a public school principal. These are the skills and these are the outcomes that we can get in line on the early learning standards and the assessment framework. I think we've got to do a better job at the state level there. Kit.
Thank you. I just have a question. Under the child outcomes, that is it the panel's responsibility to identify which platform we're because those three, the DOTS teaching strategies and HighScope, although there's similarities, they're different. So if we give that as a choice, what will happen? People will just choose. And so we won't be able to get data to really see what the outcomes are. So yeah. I was just wondering.
I think what we're looking for, which, and my folks can correct me if they disagree, but what we're looking for is kind of to get guidance about, should the state move to a single platform? Because then you'd have, data across the state about where kids are on the 6 domains on a common framework. And that framework, it would be critical that it's aligned with our early learning and development standards that we're super proud of. So we have the DOT. So, I think we're looking for guidance of if we should have a single one, and then the agency would look at the pros and cons of the different systems and then make a decision on one. But right now it's sort of use whatever you want and pick one that's aligned with the LDS. And we're also saying for state funded centers, use the DOTS, but then in some communities, they were having to do the DOTS and they also had to do Teaching Strategies Gold. And then if they were in a public school as a school readiness program, they might have a third one. So I think we're looking for, should the state adopt a single platform? But Deb, you can correct me, either Deb. That is sort of the guidance I was thinking about it, not as the panel tell us which one would lead to a process.
Just quickly, I'll say I'll concur with the process and maybe add a little bit more color to the idea that the process, and if the panel thinks there are particular things we ought to be knowing about children to help frame the decision about the tools that would
Yeah.
allow us to know that would be helpful as well. Deb Adams, I don't know if you have anything else.
Not that I have much depth to add, but there is a history about this for those of us that have been around for a while with the old PAF, the first iteration, right, of the kindergarten inventory. So we do have a history, the Brigance. And I just would say that we all know as early childhood educators in the profession, not one measure tells the whole story, right? So
Right.
whatever, if there is a thing that's chosen, what other opportunities for narrative or what other opportunities about a
Right.
whole child approach
Yeah.
would there be, right? Because it's a sticky wicket, right? It's assessing children on one tool is sticky. So the reliability of the data, I'm channeling Jessica Goldstein at this point,
Yeah.
but yeah, that's all that I would add. There's a history, and it's worth probably looking back to see where some of the pitfalls were in the history, as well as some of the things that could possibly be leveraged.
And I think another question too, that some great thinking could be added to is around what else holistically, when we look at children holistically, would be important to capture and to know, right, about child's health, for example, or well-being, in addition to, learning and development as well, right? Is there importance to understanding vision or hearing or medical, health-related questions as well?
Thank you. I think I was also thinking more towards the staff, the teachers, the workforce who's doing all these things, all this assessment, the dots, the teaching strategies, and then whatever else we give them to do assessment. So my thoughts more was, I would like to go to just one existing platform, but Connecticut Dots doesn't also capture the whole child. So there may be other ways, but so that's what I was thinking more, that teachers will say, oh, I have to learn teaching strategies, or I have to learn something else to do for assessment.
Mm-hmm.
Commissioner, if I may make
Yeah.
one last comment, and I don't know exactly what throughout the early child care spectrum, what you received or where you are with behavioral supports with all of the children, because we did an awful lot with K through 12 and continuing that work. And I'm sure there's need, and we should maybe talk a little bit about that at some point. What can we do more to help these early children as they progress in the right way? But just, I don't want to overlook that. I don't know how many of the programs have anyone they can rely if they have a behavioral issue, and where do they go for their assistance, and just throwing that out there, that it's something that I think it's not too premature anymore when you think about it. And to go back with what Karen was saying, yes, I think we're doing that. We have to get that message out that this is a continuum. I'm glad that OEC is separate from SDE, and that's important because you're able to focus on what you need and where you are better. But I think there has to be a good understanding that this goes right from birth right the way through. We have to continue to work on that.
Right, and we know that really the ground that the early years really establish emotional regulation, and which why we're launching universal home visiting in Bridgeport this year. But you make a good point in this equity and access group. We should make sure that there's something in there about that programs have access to behavioral health supports, so that children aren't being expelled. You know, preschool children are 10 times more likely to be expelled than elementary students. Because of so many private programs, and they don't have to hold on to the children. And to your point, there aren't supports. We're lucky at OEC, we've just have a new position. Lorna Thomas Farquharson is our manager of our early childhood behavioral supports. And it's making a big difference being able to bring all those pieces together that are in home visiting, in the early assessment, a screening tool that's Sparkler. We have a number of programs, but I do think that's actually an important item to add. Lorna, are there items in there related to that now? Behavioral health supports in the access?
Not specifically, but I think it's very much inferred, but it's important for it to be specific so we
Because
know what.
Yeah.
Right. Very good point made. Thank you so much, Representative, for that, because you're right. It's never too early to address and intervene, having a preventative standpoint stand.
Yeah.
So very excellent points.
No, and thank you very much for your work. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, other items on equity and access that might be on your mind. Or workforce that's still on your mind.
If I may, sorry about this, but
No,
I was a little bit confused. I know, you know, and we've looked in southeastern Connecticut and we're all fingers crossed, we're going to keep moving with the in Groton with a new facility there with TVCCA. But when I put in that proposal about time business and facilities and working, then I learned at another meeting that wait a minute, we don't really need more facilities until not that one that I just mentioned, but in general, looking as the recommendation, because we need to build the workforce first, we have to get the teachers, we have to do the recruit, then that could go. So I wouldn't necessarily say facility development, maybe I'm wrong, but I thought it was an important piece until I learned differently at one of the Alliance meetings. So like maybe a little more thought.
I think, unfortunately, we're at a point, particularly in Eastern Connecticut, where we have to they need help in every way. There's not, you know, when Norwich said they're getting rid of 200 early childhood spots, there was no facility that could absorb that anywhere close to Norwich. So, and we know it's a childcare desert out there. So there are parts of the state that do have facility needs, and then there are other parts of the state that maybe don't have facility needs, but there have been recommendations, I think, coming out of the panel around really looking at existing spaces, like partnering with churches to see if there's space and maybe places where schools aren't using all their capacity. But this is something we'll talk more about in the financing group. And, you know, we have to prioritize, but I think it's one of those both and, you know, we have tremendous workforce issues. I think everyone on this call is saying compensation first, understood, but still in certain parts of the state, there's a real need for facilities too.
Right. And I appreciate that it would be targeted, you know, because I agree. Southeastern Connecticut has to be exempt because they have that desert. So we do need to stay focused, but going forward, rather than putting let's do the things that we see in a priority and do the facilities, yes, but have it in a very structured way going forward that we know where and when.
And I think this is where the recommendations around community planning are so important, and Althea's point about making sure the people are at the table representing all the different points of view and supporting good community planning. So I think it all works together, and that's why we need 5 years for the plan.
Yeah.
I wish we could flip a switch, like you're saying, if we could open a building for 400 kids in that area tomorrow, but we couldn't staff it, you know, so it does all have to sort of move together.
Thank you for that.
Althea.
And lastly, I think I may have mentioned this before, and I was asking if I was writing and I may have missed something, but mentioned this before about when we talk about access as transportation. It was something that was made available to families before. And when you have the opportunity to access a pre-K 3 or 4 slot, it may not be in your neighborhood. It may not be in your community. And, you know, if transportation is not available, we have families who just will decline, right? That opportunity, especially in a city like Waterbury, we do have public transportation, but it can be very cumbersome to families who live in very, you know, far, you know, isolated parts of the city, and it takes 2 buses just to get from one end of the city to the next, and that could be overwhelming for a parent who may have more than one child. So transportation, I'm not sure what that looks like, at least for, again, pre-K 3 and 4 located in our schools. We're already providing transportation to those buildings already. Is there opportunity to, again, expand that support for families who are hoping to benefit from the opportunities for all the things we said here, why it works best
Yeah.
for children. But they have to reject that opportunity because they can't get their child there.
Yeah, I think that is such transportation is major in the equity and access. And I don't know that it's standing out as a major barrier, but it does make you think about some of the public school options in a different way because it comes with transportation. Representative McCarty in Norwich, every school day, school year space with transportation was filled. But the full day, full year spaces were not filled because the parents had to get the kids there. And it speaks to Althea's parents do need school full day, full year care. When you ask parents, they say that, and our parent cabinet has been clear about that. But I'm just saying there are times when the transportation outweighs the need for full day care. And so I think the equity and access group needs to look at community-based solutions in neighborhoods and look at opportunities that bring parents transportation as well. So I think in Connecticut, we really believe in this mixed model that some of it's public schools, some of it's private programs, some community-based. And we're really committed to that because I think the whole system sort of falls apart without it. Because you can't have access to infant toddler care if you don't have preschoolers in the community-based programs. So we're committed to that. But I think for transportation, we've got to keep transportation up higher on our list than it is right now, because the kids who aren't accessing preschool or childcare, transportation is really the major barrier for those families. Any other questions for our panel members, leads that you're really struggling with as we're taking in feedback before we close out? Okay, well, an hour and a half goes pretty fast. And maybe not to you all, but to me, this has been really fascinating. And because you've had extra time to dig in, things are going to be spinning in your head. So you please send feedback to Eloisa or to me as things come to you. We'll be meeting again on Wednesday morning around systems. And I think you're going to see some familiar themes. And we're also going to break out of these 4 groups because no matter how we slice it, there's just so much overlap. And I think the challenge for us is going to be prioritization in the end, because, you know, you heard Representative McCarty say, these are all great recommendations. And we're saying we have a 5-year plan and we need to stage it. Then we're going to have to think about funding and costs. So those are going to be the hard decisions. So right now we're still sort of getting the ideas out, flushing them out, seeing what we're missing. And meetings like this really help us so much. And so this is over and above your duty, but we had a nice mix of higher ed providers and community people doing community work. So we really appreciate you joining us, and OEC team and SVP and social finance. You guys are the best team in baseball. I'm so grateful that you're here listening, and I know you'll bring all these ideas and help me make sense of them. So I hope everybody has a good night. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you.